The legend of the craft is also justified in saying that Solomon organized these masons into what might be called a guild, that is, a society or corporation. Footnote. The Latin original of the Krauss manuscript calls it Societas Architectonica, an architectural society, by giving them charges and manners, in other words, a code of laws and regulations. On this question, the Bible account is silent, but it amounts to an extreme probability, the nearest approximation to historical evidence, that there must have been some regulations enacted for the government of so large a number of workmen. It is also equally probable that to avoid confusion, these workmen must have been divided into sections, or what, in modern parlance, would be called gangs, engaged in various parts of the building and in different employments. There must have been a higher and more skillful class occupied in directing the works of these several sections. There must have been others less skillful and yet competent to discharge the duties of stonecutters and layers, and there must have been another and still inferior class, only acquiring the rudiments of the profession. Founded on these evident propositions, Anderson made his division of the workmen at the temple into the three classes of master masons, fellow crafts, and entered apprentices. But he abandoned the legend in calling the 3,600 officers of King Solomon master masons, and making the whole number exclusive of the 70,000 laborers and the 30,000 woodcutters on Mount Lebanon, 83,000, and afterward stating that there were 183,000 masons in all, a contradiction of his own previous statement, as well as of the legend of the craft, which states the whole number of masons to have been 80,000. The modern ritual may, however, be considered as having adopted the Temple of Jerusalem as a type of that abstruse symbol of a spiritual temple, which forms, as will be hereafter seen, one of the most important and most interesting symbolic lessons on which the philosophy of speculative masonry depends. But viewing it as an historical statement, it is devoid of all claims to credence. The facts stated in the ritual are an outgrowth of those contained in the legend of the craft, which it has greatly altered by unauthorized additions, and it is in entire contradiction to those given in the books of Kings and Chronicles. The claim that Freemasonry took its origin at the building of the temple is without any historical authority. The legend of the craft, upon which, to be consistent, all Masonic rituals should be founded, assigns its origin equally to two other periods, to that of the building of the Tower of Babel, when Nimrod was Grand Master, and to Egypt under the geometrician Euclid. Why the Temple of Solomon was exclusively selected by the modern Masons as the incunabulum of their order can be only conjecturally accounted for. I am not unwilling to believe, for reasons that have been already assigned, that the operative or stonemasons of the Middle Ages had some tradition or legend of the origin of the institution at the Temple of Solomon. If so, I am inclined to attribute their selection of this in preference to any other stately edifice of antiquity to these reasons. Medieval Masons were, as an association of builders, most intimately connected with the ecclesiastics of that age. Their principal home at one time was in the monasteries. They worked under the immediate patronage and supervision of bishops and abbots, and were chiefly engaged in the construction of cathedrals and other religious edifices. Private houses at that early period were mostly built of wood, and the building of them was the business of carpenters. The trio were Pt.I, literally the tree workman, in modern phrase the carpenter, was one of the most important handicrafts of the early Anglo-Saxons. He was the builder of their ships as well as of their houses, and the trade is frequently spoken of in ancient Saxon documents. He was constantly employed in the construction of vessels for the carrying on of trade, or the erection of dwellings for the residences of the people. To the stonemasons was exclusively entrusted the nobler vocation of building religious edifices, imbued from their connection with the priests as well as from their peculiar employment with religious sentiments. They naturally looked for the type of the great cathedrals which they were erecting, not to pagan temples, however splendid might be their architecture, but rather to that Jewish cathedral which had been consecrated on Mount Moriah to the worship of the true God. Hence the brief notice of that building in the legend of the craft was either the suggestion of that esoteric legend of the temple which has not, from its necessarily oral character, been handed down to us, or if the written legend was posterior in time to the oral one, then it was a brief record of it. But I do not believe that this lost legend of the stonemasons was ever intended to be historical. It was simply a symbol to illustrate the idea that the temple at Jerusalem was the type of all Christian cathedrals. This symbolic legend, which I suppose to have existed among the stonemasons of the Middle Ages, was probably lost before the revival of Masonry in the year 1717. Anderson therefore framed a new legend out of the legend of the craft, the scriptural account, and his own invention. On this Andersonian legend, simple in the first edition of the Constitutions, but considerably expanded in the second, modern ritualists have framed another legend, which in many important details differs from Anderson's, from the legend of the craft, and from the account in the Bible. This is the legend now accepted and believed by the great body of the craft to be historically true. That it has no claim to historical credence is evident from the fact that it is, in its most important details, unauthorized, and in fact contradicted by the scriptural account, which is the only authentic memorial that we have of the transactions that took place at the building of the Solomonic Temple. And moreover, the long period that elapsed between the building of the temple 1,000 years before the Christian era and the time not earlier than the 3rd century after Christ, during which we have no traces of the existence of such an architectural association connected with Jewish masons and transmitted from them to the Christian architects, presents an extensive lacuna which must be filled by authentic records before we can be enabled as scholars investigating truth to consent to the theory that the Freemasons of the present day are, by uninterrupted successions, the representatives of the Masons wrought at King Solomon's temple. The legend of the ritual is, in fact, a symbol, but a very important and a very interesting one, and as such will be fully discussed when the subject of Masonic symbols comes to be treated in a subsequent part of this work.